Rh negative is very rare. Most of the world didn't have it until colonization started in the 15th century.
Imagine your body seeing your unborn child as a foreign invader. For 15% of us, this isn't a horror plot, but a biological reality. Rh negative blood is the only genetic trait that actively tries to end its own lineage. This blood type hides a 35,000-year-old secret that completely defies the laws of Darwin. But if this blood is so dangerous to reproduction, why did nature let it survive for 35 millennia? Are we looking at a forgotten branch of humanity? The war inside the womb? What if I told you that for thousands of years, a specific group of humans lived under a reproduction tax that could wipe out their entire family tree in a single generation? It sounds like something out of a dark dystopian novel, but this is the heavy reality of the rhesus factor. To understand why this is such a massive deal, we have to look at the tiny proteins sitting on your red blood cells. If you have what scientists call the D antigen, you are Rh positive, which covers about 85% of the population. But if you don't have it, you are Rh negative, and that is where the biology starts to look like a high-stakes battlefield. When an Rh negative mother carries an Rh positive baby,
Rhesus positive and a rhesus negative parents were to have an offspring, there is a potential danger to the offspring.
her immune system doesn't see a child, it sees a foreign invader. It is honestly wild to think about, but her body essentially puts out a biological wanted poster and begins producing antibodies to attack the baby's blood cells. This is known as hemolytic disease of the fetus and newborn, and it is a complete anomaly in the natural world. This specific genetic standoff is a mystery that science still hasn't fully solved because it goes against every basic rule of survival. Usually, if a trait makes it harder for a species to reproduce, evolution just deletes it from the archives. But Rh negative blood has stubbornly stuck around for at least 35,000 years, refusing to leave. Have you ever wondered why nature would create a glitch that targets the most vulnerable among us? It feels less like a random mutation and more like an invisible wall between two different kinds of people who were never meant to mix. Before modern medicine gave us the Rogam shot in 1968, this cellular war meant that many families were stuck after their first child, unable to grow their lineage without facing a tragedy. It is a biological conflict that feels incredibly personal, yet it is happening on a global scale. Does it feel like a simple mistake to you? Or could this be a deliberate sign of a deeper history that the mainstream textbooks are just skipping over? Think about the sheer persistence of this trait. It has survived ice ages, migrations, and the rise and fall of empires, even though it carries a massive risk to the next generation. If this blood type is so deadly to its own kind, where did the first person with Rh negative blood actually come from? It is time we stop looking at the symptoms and start looking at the source of this 35,000-year-old puzzle. The 35,000-year timestamp. While the history books tell one story, our DNA tells another, and it is a story that points directly to a freezing European winter 350 centuries ago. To really get to the bottom of where this blood type comes from, we have to look at a very specific group of people living in the mountains between Spain and France, known as the Basques. These people are a complete anomaly because they have the highest concentration of Rh negative blood on the entire planet, with nearly 35% of them carrying the trait. For a long time, people just guessed at why they were so different. But in 2021, some massive genomic studies published in major journals like Cell and Nature finally gave us the receipts we needed to back this up. The data shows that the Basque are basically a genetic time capsule from the early European hunter-gatherers. While the rest of the world was busy migrating and mixing, this specific group stayed almost entirely isolated for tens of thousands of years. It is absolutely fascinating because their DNA doesn't just show a different blood type, it shows a lineage that stabilized roughly 35,000 years ago during the Upper Paleolithic. This was right around the same time that the Neanderthals were disappearing, and the first modern humans, the Cro-Magnons, were truly making Europe their home. If a group of people stayed isolated for 35,000 years, what were they hiding from? And could a single blood type be the only thing left of a forgotten civilization? The mystery goes even deeper when you look at their language, Euskara. Just like their blood, their language is what scientists call a language isolate, which means it has no known relatives on the entire planet. It is like they appeared out of nowhere with a unique way of speaking and a unique way of surviving that nobody else had. Honestly, when you look at the facts and the dates, you start to realize that Rh-negative blood isn't just a random mutation that happened last week. It is a biological signature that has been preserved with incredible precision since the Ice Age. Have you ever stopped to think about how rare it is for a group to keep their identity so pure for that long? It is like they were guarding a secret in their very cells that the rest of humanity somehow lost along the way. But it wasn't just isolation that kept them alive, because they actually had a secret shield hidden in their veins. The parasite shield, a devil's bargain. Scientists finally found a reason for the madness when they realized that Rh-negative blood might actually be an immunological fortress against a silent killer. For decades, the big question was why a blood type that complicates pregnancy would even exist in the first place. But evolutionary biologist Jaroslav Fleger eventually stumbled upon a discovery that changes everything. It turns out that people with Rh-negative blood have a significantly higher resistance to a sneaky parasite called Toxoplasma gondii. Now, you might have heard of this one because it is famously carried by cats, and while it usually just sits quietly in most people, it can actually mess with your reaction times and neurological health over time. In the ancient world, being just a fraction of a second slower could be the difference between spotting a predator and becoming dinner. Fleger's research suggests that while Rh-positive individuals might see their health and coordination decline after being infected, those with Rh-negative blood seem to have a built-in biological shield that keeps them sharp. It is essentially a prehistoric superpower that allowed this specific lineage to survive in environments where others were literally slowing down. This revelation suggests that the Rh-negative trait isn't a mistake at all, but a high-level survival strategy that saved our ancestors from a silent biological threat. However, this protection came with what I like to call a cursed trade-off, or a devil's bargain. Evolution essentially looked at the situation and decided that it was worth sacrificing a few pregnancies if it meant the adults survived long enough to keep the tribe going. It is a cold and calculated move from Mother Nature, but it explains why this blood type hasn't vanished the risks to newborns. If you had to choose between a blood type that protects you from a brain-altering parasite but endangers your future offspring, which would you pick? It is a heavy question that makes you realize just how brutal the struggle for survival really was 35,000 years ago. Is this trade-off the real reason Rh-negative blood has managed to stay in the human gene pool for so long? It certainly makes more sense than a random accident, as it shows a clear functional advantage that would have been vital in the wild. But if this was such a winning survival strategy, why doesn't every single human on the planet have it by now? And why is the RHD gene just completely missing from their DNA? It feels like we are looking at a deliberate choice in our genetic history rather than a slow, natural change. The missing gene, an evolutionary glitch. Most mutations in the human body tend to add something new to our genetic blueprint, but Rh-negative is famous for what it doesn't have because it is literally a hole in our genetic code. When we look at the molecular science behind this, things get incredibly weird. You see, being Rh-negative isn't just a slight variation or a tiny typo in your DNA. According to research in molecular biology and evolution, it is a complete and total deletion of the RHD gene. It is like you are reading a high-stakes instruction manual for building a human, and someone just ripped out an entire page. Scientists call this a gene deletion, but I like to think of it as a biological amputation. While the rest of the world carries this rhesus protein on their blood cells, 15% of the population just has an empty space there. Why would nature take a vital piece of instructions from our DNA and just throw it away? Usually, evolution is about building and adapting, not subtracting something that seems to have a clear function in our biology. What makes this even more of a head-scratcher is that this specific genetic glitch is uniquely human. If you look at our closest relatives, like chimpanzees, gorillas, or orangutans, you will notice something striking because they are all Rh positive. Not a single one of them has this RHD gene deletion. This means that at some point in our history, we branched off in a way that no other primate on the planet ever did. We became the only species capable of producing a blood type that rejects its own offspring. Have you ever stopped to wonder if that gene was the very thing making us vulnerable to something in the ancient world? It is almost as if our ancestors were forced to hit the delete button on a part of themselves just to keep the human race from going extinct. This feels less like a random accident and more like a desperate survival move that left a permanent scar on our genome. It is a biological mystery that peer-reviewed journals can describe perfectly. Yet they still cannot explain the why behind the deletion. Was this a natural mistake, or was it a tactical sacrifice? It is fascinating to realize that the very thing that makes this blood type a medical challenge today might have been the only thing that kept us alive 35,000 years ago. This leads us to a theory that no one is talking about, the ghost lineage. The ghost lineage. Forget the aliens for a second. What if Rh negative isn't some new upgrade or an experimental mutation, but the original blood of the first humanity that almost went extinct? When we look at the population dynamics and the weirdly specific timing of this blood type, a new narrative starts to emerge that is honestly more chilling than any sci-fi theory. We are talking about a ghost lineage. Thousands of years ago, the human race might have hit a massive biological wall, a prehistoric global pandemic, or a specific parasite that targeted the RHD gene. In that world, having that gene was basically a death sentence, and the only people who survived were the ones who suffered a massive genetic accident. Imagine a tribe 35,000 years ago where every single person is dying from a mysterious plague, except for a few individuals who were born with a broken code. Their bodies had deleted the very gene the virus was using to unlock their cells. They were the survivors, the genetic amputees who lived through the Great Filter while the rest of the original human population was wiped off the map. This would mean that Rh-negative people aren't the newcomers.
Fact is that Rh-negative people, and again, there's 15% of them on this planet, may have come from outside sources.
They are the last remnants of an ancient humanity that had to sacrifice its own biological compatibility just to stay alive. This theory actually explains the extreme isolation of groups like the Basque. They weren't just being unfriendly, they were the descendants of a ghost population that had to stay away from the new humans to avoid a biological war they couldn't win. It is a complete flip of the script that mainstream science usually avoids because it suggests our history is much more fractured than we like to admit. If this lineage survived the Ice Age and the Plague, it would explain why their bodies still react so violently to the standard human blood today. Could we be looking at the last survivors of a first humanity that was almost erased from the planet? It is a heavy thought to realize that the person sitting next to you with Rh-negative blood might be carrying a biological signature of a world that ended before ours even began. What if we are the ones walking around with the weird mixed blood, and they are the only ones left carrying the pure, original defense system of our ancestors? When you look at the selection-migration models in the annals of human genetics, you see that these two groups should have merged, or one should have vanished a long time ago. The fact that they both still exist suggests a deep, intentional separation that lasted for millennia. This isn't just a story about blood. It is a story about two different versions of humanity trying to share a single planet without accidentally wiping each other out. But the mystery doesn't just sit in the dusty corners of the past, because it is affecting people in the modern world in ways we are only just beginning to measure. Modern sensory anomalies. Did you know that some fascinating studies suggest Rh-negative individuals might actually experience the world through a completely different sensory lens than the rest of us? It is one thing to have a different blood type, But it is another thing entirely to have a body that seems to operate on a different frequency. When you look at the modern data on physiological traits, you start to see patterns that mainstream science hasn't quite figured out how to explain yet. We are talking about a group of people who consistently show lower resting blood pressure and a lower average body temperature compared to the general population. It is as if their internal thermostat is set to a slightly different calibration that dates back thousands of years. There are also those persistent claims about higher IQ levels among Rh negatives, and while we should definitely take that with a grain of healthy skepticism, it is hard to ignore the specific cognitive differences that show up in sensory testing. Many people in the Rh negative community report an almost uncanny sensitivity to things that others don't even notice, like low-frequency sounds or subtle changes in humidity and barometric pressure. It is like they are walking around with a built-in weather station or a highly tuned antenna that the rest of us just didn't get in our genetic starter pack. This heightened awareness is a massive unsolved trait because it suggests that Rh negative bodies are still finely tuned to a prehistoric environment that has long since vanished. Have you ever noticed a sensitivity to the environment that everyone else seems to miss? Or do you have Rh negative blood and feel like you're just built a little differently?
Rh negative blood. And Rh negative blood is one of the most unusual.
It is fascinating to think that these aren't just random quirks, but functional remnants of a survival kit from 35,000 years ago. Science can map the proteins and the genes all day long, but they still can't explain why these specific physical extras seem to cluster around this one missing gene. It makes you wonder if the deletion we talked about earlier was actually a way to sharpen the other senses to compensate for a world that was becoming increasingly dangerous. There is also a weirdly high frequency of reported anomalous experiences within this group, from strange dreams to feeling out of place in modern society. While that might sound a bit out there for a lab report, the sheer volume of these anecdotes has kept researchers curious for decades. If your body is literally operating at a lower temperature and a higher sensory alert level, it only makes sense that your perception of reality would be slightly skewed compared to the majority. It is like being a high-definition screen in a world that is still broadcasting in standard definition. We are looking at a living, breathing mystery that is walking among us right now, carrying a biological legacy that refuses to be ignored. Do you think your body is still tuned to a world that existed 35,000 years ago? Or are we just looking at a series of coincidences that we've stitched together into a mystery? Whatever the case, the receipts are building up, and the more we look at the modern science of the Rh negative factor, the more it feels like we are only seeing the tip of the iceberg. We might have the high-tech tools to map the entire human genome, but the Rh negative whole remains a silent witness to a history that we have mostly forgotten. Even with the latest genetic results, we are still left wondering if this blood type is a survival scar from an ancient plague or some kind of mysterious gift from a lost civilization. Is your blood a biological time capsule from a world that existed long before our own? What do you think is the real reason for this 35,000-year mystery that continues to baffle the brightest minds in science? Is it just a random glitch, or are we looking at the last evidence of a separate human lineage? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, because we want to hear your theories on where this missing gene actually went. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the secrets hidden in our veins, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join us.